So, in previous episode we discussed about attitude. That attitudes are favorable or unfavorable evaluations of people, objects or events or just about anything in our environment. Regardless of how you might evaluate, what exactly is an attitude made of? Is it a feeling? Is it a thought? Is it an act? So, we will examine the three basic components of attitude. If I were to ask you, what is your attitude towards lizards? Your answer might be quite clearly negative. If I were to know or ask you, what is your attitude towards giving death penalty to kidnappers? Your answer might not be as clear. Clearly then, attitudes have several properties that are dynamic and have implications for information processing, retrieval and behavior. We shall discuss some such properties here. The ABCs of attitude. Favorable or unfavorable evaluations towards something that define a person's attitude can be exhibited in beliefs, feelings, or inclination to act. This is known as the multidimensional or tri-component view of attitudes. Example: Breckler 1984, Katz and Stotland 1959. These three components represent the basic building blocks of attitude. Consider, for example, my attitude towards swimming. Because I believe that it is an excellent form of exercise, I feel like liking towards it and therefore intend to swim every day, at least in summers. These dimensions are known as the ABCs of attitudes. Affect means feelings, behavior, tendency to act, and cognition, thoughts. Let us examine these three components which were adapted from Mears 2005. Affect, cognition and behavior. Affect. Affect refers to feelings or emotions that are evoked by a particular person, item or event. The attitude, object or the focus of our attitude, for example, fear, sympathy, hate, like, pleasure. You may feel positively or negatively about your boss, the painting in your office lobby, or the fact that your company just bagged a big contract. It may mean a bigger bonus. It may also mean strict and deadlines and hard work. Obviously, such feelings can vary in intensity. For example, I may very strongly like classical music but have only a casual dislike of carrots. Such feelings form from our experiences or observing experiences and serve to guide our future behavior. I may be more inclined to go to a musical concert by Pandit Bhimsen Joshi and may be less inclined to avoid carrots. Much of attitude research has emphasized the importance of affective or emotion components. Emotion works hand in hand with the cognitive process or the way we think about an issue or situation. Emotional appeals are commonly found in advertising, health campaigns and political messages. Any discrete emotion can be used in a persuasive appeal. This may include jealousy, disgust, indignation, fear, humor, and anger. For example, a pack of cigarettes now contains a picture of black lungs along with a message that says smoking kills, tobacco causes cancer, designed to arouse fear. Research suggests that affect plays a very important role in attitude formation. For instance, Kim Lim and Bhargava 1998 conducted 2 experiments using established conditioning procedures to assess the impact of affect on formation of attitudes towards certain products. The result indicated that affect can influence attitudes even in the absence of product beliefs. Experiment 1. Further, affect plays as important or more important a role than the belief mechanism in attitude formation depending on the number of repetitions. Experiment 2. Affect is a common component in attitude change, persuasion, social influence, and even decision making. How we feel about an outcome may override purely cognitive rationales. Cognition. Attitudes involve more than just feeling. They also involve knowledge. What you believe to be the case about an attitude object, for example, you might believe that studying psychology will help you understand other people better and equip you to deal with them. Whether it is completely accurate or completely false, quite true in this case. This belief comprises the cognitive component of your attitude towards psychology. When you form your opinion or judgment on the basis of available information and decide whether you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion on that, it is the cognitive part of an attitude we are talking about. The term cognition literally means to know, to conceptualize, or to recognize. Hence, the cognitive component of attitude is the storage component where we organize information about an attitude object. It comprises of our thoughts, beliefs, opinions, and ideas about the attitudinal object. As we saw in the last unit, beliefs are cognition about the probability that an object or event is associated with a given attribute. Fishbein and Edson, 1975. When a human being is the object of an attitude, the cognitive component is frequently a stereotype. For example, Punjabis are fun-loving. It is suggested that the congruence between affective and cognitive components may influence the intention to behave. For example, whether someone actually uses a condom may depend upon the congruence between his feelings about it, pleasure versus displeasure, and his beliefs that using a condom will prevent him from AIDS. Behavior. As just mentioned, the things you believe about something, for example, my boss is corrupt and is misusing company funds, and the way you feel about it, example, I can't stand working for him, may have some effect on the way you are predisposed to behave. Example, I'm going to quit my present job. Thus, attitudes have a behavioral component, a tendency or predisposition to act in a certain manner. Note that behavior is different from a behavioral tendency. It may seem logical to assume that if we have a negative attitude for a particular object, your boss in the above example, it is likely to be translated into a particular type of behavior such as avoidance of your boss and even looking for an alternative job. However, such behavioral tendency may not actually be predictive of your actual behavior. Behaviors are typically defined as overt actions of an individual. For example, although you may be interested in taking a new job, you might not actually take it if a better one with higher or at least similar salary and designation is not available. It is thus important to note that your intention to behave in a certain way may or may not translate into how you actually behave. It is more reasonable to assume that one's behavioral intention, the verbal indication or typical behavioral tendency of an individual rather than actual behavior is more likely to be in tune with his affective and cognitive components. Consider this. You may believe that smoking is injurious to health. You may fear that you may get cancer, yet you may continue to smoke. At the same time, you may have an intention to quit smoking. Hence, your behavior towards an attitude object may not be in line with how you feel about it, affect, and what you know about it, cognition. We will examine the link between attitude and behavior more closely in next episode. Though most attitudes have all three components, they can be more strongly rooted in either the cognitive or the affective component. It is also possible that all three aspects are not always present in an attitude. Research indicates that not all three of these components need to be in place for an attitude to exist. Eagly and Chaiken 1993. For example, you could develop a positive attitude towards a product that you see on television, say a sauna belt. Without developing any belief about it, you may lack knowledge about it and hence don't know if it will really work or ever engaging in any purchase behavior. In fact, research has demonstrated that we can develop a positive attitude towards a product simply by repeatedly being exposed to it. This is known as the mere exposure effect. Zhejiang 1968. The tendency to develop more positive feelings towards objects and individuals the more we are exposed to them. We seem to naturally develop a liking for some things that are repeatedly presented to us. Be it a stranger in a neighborhood or our own face. Don't you start liking a song and maybe even humming it after hearing it many times on the radio? Let me give you another quick demonstration. Think about the following questions quickly without giving much thought. What are your favorite letters of the alphabet? I'm sure you would have answered with a letter with which your own name begins. This demonstrates a well-demonstrated phenomenon in social psychology. People of different nationalities, language, and ages prefer the letter appearing in their own name and those that frequently appear in their own languages. This is in line with the mere exposure effect. The significance of the mere exposure effect regarding the three components of attitude is simple. It illustrates how sometimes affect can become associated with an object independent of any knowledge about it. These feelings-based attitudes represent a very powerful and represents a very powerful form of evaluation. Though affective and cognitive components tend to be intertwined for primarily affect-based attitudes, it is more difficult to produce cognitive counter-arguments in the resistance to persuasion and attitude change. Let's take a look at properties of attitudes. For many years, social psychologists have been interested in the structural properties of attitudes. One way to examine structure of attitude is to look at its three components, the ABCs of attitudes. Another way in which we can examine the structure of attitudes is by exploring the dynamic implication for information processing, retrieval, and judgment. Attitudes have dynamic properties in addition to the somewhat static ones. As discussed in the previous episode, let us examine the dynamic properties of attitude. Attitude strength. Attitude differ in strength. Strong, central attitudes are attitudes that refer to important attitude objects that are strongly related to the self. These attitudes are often related to important values. Attitude strength involves several dimensions such as certainty, how much the individual knows about the attitude object, intensity and extremity. Extremity refers to the degree of favorableness or unfavorableness towards the attitude object. Intensity refers to the strength of the feeling, that is, how strong is the emotional reaction provoked by the attitude object. For example, both Tanya and Vedika have a negative attitude towards dogs. Tanya avoids touching a dog while Vedika grows pale even at the sight of a dog. Attitude origin. Attitude formed through direct experience are generally stronger than those formed without such experience. Vedika may have been bitten by a dog herself, while Tanya may have just heard about her story. Personal importance. The extent to which an individual cares about the attitude. One key determinant of personal importance is vested interest. The extent to which the attitude is personally relevant to the individual who holds it, in that the object or issue to which it refers has important consequences for this individual. For example, if a new law is proposed that prohibits drinking below the age of 25 years, you may react more strongly to it if you are around 22 or 23 years or 24, as opposed to if you are 40 years old and thus unaffected by the change in drinking. Age. Research shows that the greater such vested interest, the stronger will be the impact of such an attitude on behavior. Further, attitudes that are intense, important, or held with great certainty are associated with clearer or more univocal and accessible attitudinal cues. Attitude accessibility. Attitude accessibility refers to the ease with which attitudes can be retrieved from memory. In other words, how readily available is an attitude about an object, issue, or situation. Some attitudes are characterized by clear, univocal, and highly accessible cues in memory, whereas others are associated with weak, ambiguous, and inaccessible cues. Accessibility is assumed to reflect the strength of association in memory between the representation of the attitudinal object and the evaluation of the object along a dimension ranging from positive to negative. Attitudes that are more accessible from memory are more predictive of behavior, influence what message are attended to, and how those messages are processed, and are more stable across time. Research has found highly accessible attitudes to be more predictive of wide variety of behaviors such as voting and selection of consumer products than are attitudes low in accessibility. Consider the example. Suppose you see a cockroach. You might have a very quick yuck response. The fast yuck response indicates an accessible attitude towards spiders. You do not have to think about whether you like cockroaches. Who does? Rather, the mere presence of a spider results in the activation of your attitude. Now imagine you are walking down a road with a friend looking for a place to eat. Your friend points to a Thai restaurant and suggests that you both eat there. Now you may have to think about whether you like Thai food because you are not really sure what you think of it before deciding that it is good, bad, and that you are ready to eat there. The fact that you have to ponder whether you like something suggests that either you have a relatively inaccessible attitude or you have never formed an attitude towards that object. Some factors are related to attitude accessibility, attitude importance, affect versus cognitive evaluation, repeated expression of the attitude. Let us consider them one by one. Research has found that issue involvement, the relevance and salience of an issue or situation to an individual is not only correlated with attitude strength, as we saw in the previous section, but also attitude access. Attitude importance and attitude accessibility are also related. Importance can result in more active seeking of attitude relevant information and more extensive elaboration of what information, which can lead to greater accessibility. Studies have shown that responses to effective evaluations are generally given faster than response to cognitive evaluations, suggesting that if affect-based evaluations are more accessible in memory than cognition-based evaluations. For example, in a study examining 20 different attitudes object, a positive correlation was found between the extent to which attitude objects were described in effective term and the accessibility of attitudes toward the object. Fazio 1995. Finally, repeated expression of an attitude tends to make that attitude more accessible in the future. Powell and Fazio 1984. The more frequently we ask subject about his attitude towards an object or issue, the quicker will be his subsequent responses to that same object or issue. Also, if an attitude object was initially evaluated positively, repeatedly attitude expression will cause positive object feature to become more strongly associated with the object than negative features, thereby leading to greater extremity. And lastly, reporting an attitude on one issue facilitates subsequent reports of related or linked attitudes. For example, if I'm asked my opinion on whether I think smoking is harmful, I will also think about tobacco chewing. Past studies conclude that accessible attitudes are more resistant to change. Attitude accessibility has also been shown to predict behavior. An accessible attitude is more likely to result in attitudinal consistent behavior than a less accessible attitude of the same balance. Attitude ambivalence. People can also be conflicted or ambivalent towards an object, meaning that they simultaneously possess both positive and negative attitudes towards the object in question. Attitude ambivalence refers to the fact that our evaluation of objects, issues, events, or people are not always uniformly positive or negative. Our evaluations are often mixed, consisting of both positive and negative reactions. A very common object of ambivalence is food. Chronic dietary experiences, a conflict between two incompatible goals. On one hand, they enjoy food and love to eat, the eating enjoyment goal. On the other, in line with societal demands on slimness, they want to lose weight loss or control goal. As a result, they experience difficulty reducing their calorie intake because eating enjoyment as an affective reaction is usually the food reaction to food stimuli. Don't you go glassy-eyed and look longingly at chocolate cakes? Attitude ambivalence occurs when there is evaluative tension associated with one's attitude because the summary includes both positive and negative evaluations. This is manifested in the person feeling mixed or torn about the attitude object. Attitude ambivalence may also be the result of conflicting values. For example, you may have an ambivalent attitude towards arranged marriage because on one hand you value obedience and adherence to parents, on the other you may value freedom and personal choice. There is some evidence that as attitude ambivalence increases, attitude behavior consistency decreases. For example, Connor and Team 2003. Further, ambivalent attitudes are less accessible than non-ambivalent ones. Individuals may recognize the underlying conflict associated with their attitudes and thus be less sure of their validity. This may lead people to conclude that they should try to avoid use of attitude. Higher ambivalence is also related to less extreme attitudes. As a matter of fact, research on attitude ambivalence originally came from interest in individuals who held neutral position on some attitudes. Research also shows that there are individual differences associated with the tendency for ambivalence. Individuals with high need for cognition who enjoy effortful cognitive processing and those who dislike ambiguity tend to have lower level of ambivalence than individuals lower on need for cognition. So here we have discussed the components of attitudes. Attitudes can be described in terms of three basic components: affect, feelings, behavior, or at least behavioral intentions, and cognition, that is thoughts, beliefs, opinions, etc. Though most attitudes have all three components, they can be more strongly rooted in either the cognitive or the affective component. All three components may not always be present in an attitude. Attitude have several dynamic properties that have implications for information processing, retrieval, and behavior. Three such properties are attitude strength, attitude accessibility, and attitude ambivalence. Thank you for listening.